C.S. Lewis often wrote about the human tendency to become consumed by our own problems, warning that an excessive focus on the self can lead to despair, anxiety, and spiritual stagnation. He believed that when we fixate on our difficulties, we inevitably lose sight of God's greater purpose and presence in our lives. This inward focus distorts our perception of reality, making our struggles appear larger than they actually are, while diminishing our awareness of God's power and love. Lewis pointed out that self-absorption, whether in pride or in sorrow, turns our hearts away from the divine, leading us into a cycle of worry and fear rather than faith and trust. In the Screwtape Letters, Lewis illustrated how even our suffering and anxieties can be used as tools to distance us from God. The senior demon, Screwtape, instructs his apprentice to keep humans focused on their troubles rather than on God, knowing that this will make them feel isolated and powerless. Lewis suggests that the enemy of faith is not always direct disbelief, but often a preoccupation with the self. When we constantly analyze our problems, we become trapped in an endless loop of doubt, making it difficult to hear God's voice or recognize His hand at work. The antidote, Lewis implies, is to shift our gaze outward and upward, toward God rather than ourselves. This perspective aligns with biblical teaching, particularly in Jesus' words in Matthew 6:33. Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Lewis echoed this truth throughout his works, emphasizing that when we prioritize God above our circumstances, we find peace, even amid trials. He believed that true spiritual growth occurs when we learn to surrender our worries and recognize that God is infinitely greater than any challenge we face. Instead of dwelling on what is wrong, he encouraged believers to focus on what is eternal, on God's goodness, His promises, and His ultimate plan. Lewis also argued that the self is not meant to be the center of our existence. In Mere Christianity, he explained that the more we obsess over our own happiness, the less happy we become. Conversely, when we shift our focus to God and others, joy and peace follow naturally. This is because the Christian life is about learning to trust and love God fully, rather than being consumed by temporary struggles. Lewis reminded readers that suffering, though real and painful, does not define our lives. Our relationship with God does. To combat the tendency towards self-absorption, Lewis suggested practical spiritual disciplines such as prayer, worship, and service to others. By turning our attention toward God and His work in the world, we break free from the cycle of worry and despair. Instead of being overwhelmed by life's problems, we learn to rest in the assurance that God is in control. Lewis's wisdom continues to resonate today, reminding us that the key to peace is not the absence of problems, but a steadfast focus on God. C.S. Lewis frequently emphasized the vastness of God compared to the smallness of human worries. He believed that one of the greatest struggles in faith is not necessarily facing difficulties, but rather losing sight of who God truly is in the midst of them. When people focus too much on their problems, they magnify them beyond their actual significance, allowing fear and anxiety to take control. Lewis urged believers to reverse this perspective, to enlarge their understanding of God's greatness, and in doing so, put their troubles in their rightful place. Throughout his writings, Lewis consistently pointed out that human concerns are temporary, while God's power and goodness are eternal. In The Problem of Pain, he explored the reality of suffering, but reminded readers that pain does not mean God is absent or indifferent. Rather, it often serves as a tool to draw people closer to Him. He argued that much of human anxiety comes from an illusion of control, where people mistakenly believe they must handle everything on their own. However, as Lewis explained, acknowledging God's greatness allows believers to relinquish their burdens and trust in His sovereignty. One of Lewis's most powerful metaphors for this truth appears in the Chronicles of Narnia, where Aslan, the great lion, represents Christ. In Prince Caspian, the young girl Lucy sees Aslan after a long time and notices that he seems much larger than before. When she mentions this, Aslan responds, "Every year you grow, you will find me bigger." This moment reflects Lewis's belief that as people mature in their faith, their understanding of God's greatness expands, and in turn, their problems seem much smaller. It is not that troubles cease to exist, but rather that they lose their overwhelming power when placed in the right perspective. Lewis also explored this theme in Mere Christianity, where he emphasized that human worries often stem from placing too much importance on earthly matters. He warned that when people focus entirely on their own fears, ambitions, or struggles, they shrink their view of God. Instead, he encouraged believers to cultivate a mindset that continually seeks God first. This aligns with Scripture, particularly Philippians 4:6-7, which urges Christians to bring their worries to God in prayer and experience His peace that surpasses understanding. The shift from worry to worship is at the heart of Lewis's message. He recognized that dwelling on problems leads to despair, while focusing on God leads to peace. He encouraged Christians to regularly meditate on God's character, His promises, and His past faithfulness. This practice helps believers see beyond immediate struggles and remember that God is in control, no matter how chaotic life may seem. Ultimately, Lewis taught that the more people focus on God, the less power their worries hold over them. Fear fades in the presence of divine majesty, and anxiety diminishes when compared to God's infinite wisdom and love. By fixing their eyes on Him, believers can experience a profound sense of peace, knowing that He is far greater than anything they face. C.S. Lewis was no stranger to suffering. His writings on pain and hardship were not merely theoretical, but deeply personal, shaped by his own experiences with loss, grief, and struggle. He believed that pain, while difficult, had a purpose in the life of a believer and could serve as a means of spiritual transformation. Rather than viewing suffering as meaningless or as evidence of God's absence, Lewis argued that it often serves as a tool for growth, refining individuals and drawing them closer to God. In The Problem of Pain, Lewis wrestled with one of the most difficult questions of faith: why a loving God would allow suffering. He acknowledged that pain is one of the greatest obstacles to belief, as it challenges the idea of a benevolent and all-powerful creator. Yet, instead of seeing suffering as proof against God's goodness, Lewis reframed it as evidence of His love. He famously wrote, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world." To Lewis, pain was not an arbitrary affliction, but a means by which God awakens people to deeper truths and calls them into a closer relationship with Him. Lewis also explored the transformative power of suffering in A Grief Observed, a raw and deeply personal account of his grief after the death of his wife, Joy Davidman. He did not shy away from expressing his anguish, doubts, and questions about God in the face of intense sorrow. Yet, through this suffering, he ultimately found a deeper understanding of faith and love. Rather than leading him to despair, his grief refined his trust in God, stripping away illusions and drawing him into a more profound reliance on divine grace. The idea that pain can be redemptive is also reflected in the Chronicles of Narnia. In The Horse and His Boy, the character Shasta endures hardship and struggle, often feeling abandoned and alone. However, he later discovers that Aslan had been guiding him all along, using his trials to shape him into the person he was meant to become. This echoes Lewis's belief that suffering, though painful in the moment, often reveals itself to be part of a greater purpose when viewed from a higher perspective. Lewis was deeply influenced by the biblical truth that suffering is not meaningless. In Romans 5, verse 3-4, Paul writes that suffering produces perseverance, character, and hope. Lewis saw suffering as a process of refining the soul, much like fire purifies gold. Though it may be painful, it ultimately draws believers closer to God, stripping away self-reliance and deepening faith. By shifting the focus from immediate pain to eternal growth, Lewis encouraged believers to see suffering not as an enemy, but as a teacher. He did not dismiss the reality of pain, but instead showed that it has the potential to shape, strengthen, and ultimately bring people closer to God. In this way, suffering becomes not a reason to turn away from God, but a path toward a deeper, more abiding faith. C.S. Lewis had a profound understanding of joy, distinguishing it from mere happiness or fleeting pleasure. He believed that true joy was not dependent on external circumstances, but was instead rooted in something far greater, God Himself. Throughout his writings, Lewis described joy as a deep, longing desire for something beyond this world, an experience that hints at the divine and points toward eternity. Unlike happiness, which can be disrupted by difficulties, joy is unshaken by life's challenges because it is anchored in something eternal. In Surprised by Joy, Lewis chronicled his own journey from atheism to Christianity, describing how joy repeatedly broke through his life in unexpected ways. He discovered that joy was not about achieving personal desires, but about encountering something far beyond himself. He wrote that joy is the serious business of heaven, suggesting that it is a gift from God, not something one can manufacture through material success or comfort. Lewis found that true joy came when he stopped seeking it in worldly things and instead turned his focus to God. This insight became a recurring theme in his works. Joy is not found in circumstances, but in the one who transcends them. This perspective is powerfully illustrated in the Chronicles of Narnia. In the last battle, the characters discover that the real Narnia is not the land they knew, but something far greater, something more real and permanent. This mirrors Lewis's belief that the joys of this world are only shadows of a greater reality, the eternal joy found in God. Even when faced with trials, suffering, and death, Lewis insisted that a deeper joy remains for those who fix their eyes on God rather than on their temporary hardships. One of the key lessons Lewis taught was that joy is not the absence of suffering, but the presence of God. He acknowledged that life is filled with pain and uncertainty, yet he argued that joy remains available to those who live with an eternal perspective. This is evident in his reflections on faith during times of suffering. In A Grief Observed, he wrestled with the sorrow of losing his wife, but ultimately found that even in deep grief, there was a kind of joy, a joy rooted in the assurance of God's love and the hope of eternity. This idea aligns with the biblical teaching found in James 1:2-3, which calls believers to consider it pure joy when facing trials, because such struggles produce perseverance and spiritual maturity. Lewis understood that true joy is not about escaping difficulties, but about finding peace and hope in the midst of them. His writings encourage believers to shift their focus from temporary troubles to the everlasting joy that comes from knowing God. Ultimately, Lewis taught that joy is found not in controlling life's circumstances, but in surrendering to the reality of God's love. When people seek God above all else, they experience a joy that cannot be shaken by the ups and downs of life. This joy, unlike fleeting happiness, is an enduring promise, a foretaste of the... C.S. Lewis believed that one of the greatest struggles in the Christian life is the battle between self-reliance and trust in God. Human nature craves control, yet the very essence of faith requires surrender. Lewis understood that true peace is not found in grasping for control, but in letting go and placing trust in God's wisdom and goodness. He frequently wrote about the importance of surrender, showing that the more people try to dictate their own lives, the more they become enslaved to worry and fear. On the other hand, those who learn to trust God experience a freedom that transcends circumstances. In Mere Christianity, Lewis describes the Christian life as one of full surrender to God. He argues that believers often attempt to give God only part of their lives, holding on to certain areas where they still want control. However, this incomplete surrender leads to inner conflict and spiritual frustration. Lewis writes, "The more we let God take us over, the more truly ourselves we become, because He made us." This paradox, that surrender leads to true freedom, was a central theme in his works. By releasing control, believers are not losing themselves, but are instead becoming who they were truly meant to be. One of the most vivid illustrations of this concept appears in The Great Divorce, where Lewis depicts souls struggling between clinging to their own desires and embracing God's will. Those who refuse to surrender remain stuck in misery, while those who relinquish control experience transformation and joy. This reflects Lewis' belief that trust in God is not a passive resignation, but an active choice to align one's life with God's purpose. When people insist on controlling their own destinies, they often create more suffering for themselves. But when they trust in God's plan, they find true peace. This theme is also reflected in Lewis's portrayal of Aslan in the Chronicles of Narnia. In The Silver Chair, Aslan tells Jill to remember his instructions even when things become confusing. She struggles to obey when challenges arise, but when she finally trusts his guidance, she finds her way. Lewis uses this story to illustrate the importance of faith and obedience. Trusting God does not mean understanding every detail of his plan. It means following him even when the path seems uncertain. Lewis's insights align with Proverbs 3:5-6, which calls believers to trust in the Lord with all their hearts and lean not on their own understanding. Trust requires faith in God's goodness, even when life feels unpredictable. Lewis acknowledged that surrender is difficult, especially when suffering is involved. Yet, he argued that resisting God only leads to greater turmoil, while trusting him brings lasting peace. In the end, Lewis taught that surrendering to God is not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. The more we let go of our need for control, the more we experience the fullness of God's love and purpose. Trusting him allows us to live freely, unburdened by fear, and assured that his plans are always greater than our own. C.S. Lewis consistently emphasized the importance of living with an eternal perspective, arguing that much of human anxiety and suffering arises from being too fixated on temporary, worldly concerns. He believed that when people focus only on the present life, they become overwhelmed by its challenges, disappointments, and uncertainties. However, when they shift their gaze toward eternity, everything falls into its proper place. Lewis taught that recognizing the reality of heaven and God's ultimate plan allows believers to navigate life with hope, joy, and purpose, even in the face of suffering. One of Lewis' most famous insights on this topic comes from Mere Christianity, where he writes, "Aim at heaven and you will get earth thrown in. Aim at earth and you will get neither." He argued that those who live only for this world inevitably find themselves dissatisfied, as nothing on earth can fully satisfy the deep longing within the human soul. This longing, which he described as a joy that nothing in this world can fulfill, is evidence that humans were made for something greater. According to Lewis, this ache for something beyond earthly life is a reflection of our eternal destiny, a sign that we were created for fellowship with God in eternity. This theme is explored beautifully in The Weight of Glory, where Lewis describes how humans often settle for lesser joys because they do not fully grasp the greatness of what God has prepared for them. He compares people to children content with making mud pies in a slum because they cannot imagine what it would be like to enjoy a holiday by the sea. In the same way, people get caught up in material pleasures and worldly worries, failing to recognize the far greater reality of heaven that awaits them. Lewis encourages believers to lift their eyes beyond their immediate struggles and to live with the expectation of the glory to come. In the Chronicles of Narnia, Lewis illustrates this eternal perspective most powerfully in the last battle. When the characters finally enter Aslan's country, they realize that everything they experienced in Narnia was only a shadow of the true reality. Aslan invites them to go further up and further in, revealing that their journey has only just begun. This moment captures Lewis's belief that heaven is not merely an end, but the true beginning of life in its fullest sense. It is a call to live with the understanding that the best is yet to come. Lewis's perspective aligns with Scripture, particularly 2 Corinthians 4:17-18, which reminds believers that their present troubles are light and momentary compared to the eternal glory that awaits them. He urged Christians not to be consumed by temporary struggles, but to view them in light of God's ultimate plan. By focusing on eternity, believers can live with a greater sense of purpose and peace. They recognize that suffering is temporary, that earthly success is fleeting, and that true fulfillment is found only in God. Lewis's wisdom continues to inspire Christians to fix their eyes on heaven and trust in the hope of eternal joy.